I've never told this story to anyone, so this is my first time, and honestly, I never imagined something like this could happen to me. It's still wild to think about. So I'm Susan, 48, and last summer, something really strange happened. It all started when my sister and her husband asked if their son, my nephew Clark, could come stay with me for a week. They said he'd been studying hard, needed a break from the city, and thought that some time in nature would do him good. I live out in the countryside, in this peaceful, secluded place, so they figured it would be perfect. The thing is, I hadn't seen Clark in years, like 5 years. Last time I saw him, he was 14, this scrawny, awkward teenager. I used to remember him with braces, shy, and always glued to his video games. But that was ages ago. Still, I agreed because, family and all that. Plus, I thought it would be nice to reconnect, catch up, and show him around. He was coming from far away, traveling by himself, so I made sure everything was set for his stay. I even cleaned up the guest room, stocked the fridge with stuff a 19-year-old guy would probably eat, and tried to remember what 19-year-olds even like these days. Anyway, I was kind of excited to see him again. It had been too long, and it would be nice to have some company around for a while. When Clark finally arrived, I was honestly taken aback for a second. I opened the door, expecting to see some version of that awkward kid I remembered, but what I saw instead literally left me speechless. The boy I had last seen was long gone. Standing there in front of me was this tall, confident, and, dare I say it, insanely attractive young man. Like model attractive. You know when someone grows up and it just catches you completely off guard. Yeah, that was Clark. He stood about 6', maybe even taller, broad shoulders, dark hair swept back in this effortless way that made him look like he walked straight out of a magazine. His jawline was sharp, and his skin had that sun-kissed glow like he'd been spending his time outdoors. His eyes, God, those deep hazel eyes, had this sparkle of youth, but with a maturity I wasn't expecting. He wasn't a kid anymore. He was, well, let's just say, if I didn't know any better, I would have thought he was just some ridiculously good-looking stranger. And look, I'm 48. I had my share of relationships. I'm no stranger to how men look. But this was something else. I was almost embarrassed by the way my thoughts immediately took a wrong turn. I hadn't seen him in 5 years, and here I was, noticing every single detail about him. The way his t-shirt clung to his chest, the slight hint of his biceps when he casually slung his backpack over his shoulder. Hell, even his jeans fit just a little too perfectly. I told myself to snap out of it. I mean, come on, this is Clark, my nephew. I quickly pushed those thoughts aside and focused on welcoming him, hoping he didn't notice my brief moment of being totally caught off guard. He grinned and hugged me, and I couldn't help but notice how solid he felt. He wasn't that skinny, awkward kid anymore. "It's been a while, Aunt Susan," he said, and his voice, deeper than I remembered, had this calm, mature tone. We went inside, and I offered him something to eat since I figured he'd be hungry after his long journey. He smiled and agreed, saying that he'd love a home-cooked meal, which of course made me feel like a proper aunt. We sat at the table and started catching up, just talking about life, his studies, his plans, what he'd been up to in the last 5 years. I tried to focus on the conversation, but my mind kept wandering. I kept sneaking glances at him, noticing how he carried himself, the way his smile lit up his face. He was so charming, and every time he laughed, it sent this weird jolt through me that I couldn't explain. And then, out of nowhere, I started thinking about how cute he was. Like, really cute. And that's when it hit me. What the hell are you doing, Susan? He's your nephew. I felt this rush of guilt, but at the same time, I couldn't deny what I was feeling. There was something about him, his confidence, his presence. It was drawing me in. And no matter how much I tried to push those thoughts away, they kept creeping back. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. I was probably just tired or overthinking it. But even as I said goodnight and headed to bed, the image of Clark, the way he looked, the way he smiled, the way he'd become this ridiculously attractive young man, stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about him, and as much as I wanted to shake it off, I couldn't help feeling something more. That evening, after we'd settled into our separate spaces, I decided I needed to run to the store to pick up a few things for the rest of the week. I wanted to give Clark a proper vacation experience while he was staying with me. Good meals, maybe some outdoor activities, just something to take his mind off his usual life. But honestly, part of me also needed a little bit of space to clear my head. The way my mind had been spinning around Clark was messing with me more than I wanted to admit. I got back after a while, carrying a couple bags of groceries, and the house was quiet. I figured Clark was probably resting after his long journey. It was already late, the sun had set, and there was this calm, almost eerie stillness in the air. But as I walked down the hallway towards my room, I passed by the bathroom, and that's when something caught my attention. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, just enough to see the light from inside spilling out into the hallway. At first, I didn't think much of it. Our bathroom door had been a little wonky for months now. It never quite closed properly and needed fixing. But then I heard the sound of water running from the shower. Clark must have been in there, washing off the day's travel. I don't know what came over me, but something made me pause, right there in the hallway, just standing by the door. It felt like an instinct, something I couldn't control. I leaned in just a bit, my heart suddenly racing for reasons I couldn't, or maybe didn't want to explain. Through that crack in the door, I caught a glimpse of Clark. He was standing in the shower, completely naked, his back facing me, and the water cascading over his body. I couldn't help but stare, frozen in place, as the scene unfolded in front of me. And what I saw, it felt wrong to admit, but it was beautiful. Clark's body had transformed into this perfectly sculpted figure, every muscle defined, his shoulders broad, tapering down to a lean, toned waist. The water ran down the length of his back, tracing the curve of his spine, and dripping off his skin in slow, mesmerizing rivulets. His buttocks were firm and smooth, the water glistening over them like something out of a painting. I stood there, breathless, feeling my pulse quicken as I watched. This wasn't the skinny, awkward boy I used to know. This was a man, fully grown, and I was standing there, staring at him in ways I shouldn't have been. But I couldn't look away. I felt this strange, almost magnetic pull, something deep inside me stirring that I hadn't felt in years. Something I didn't even want to acknowledge. It was that undeniable attraction, the kind that I hadn't felt for anyone in such a long time. Just when I thought I had let myself get too close, Clark moved. He reached up to turn the shower head, and in that moment, I snapped out of whatever trance I had been in. My heart leaped into my throat, and I quickly backed away from the door, suddenly terrified that he might catch me. I fled down the hallway, my mind racing, my thoughts all over the place. What the hell had I just done? What was I thinking? I rushed into my bedroom, shutting the door behind me, leaning against it, trying to calm myself down. My cheeks were flushed, my heart was still pounding in my chest, and my thoughts were a tangled mess. How could I let myself do something like that? I told myself it was just a moment of weakness, that it didn't mean anything. But the truth was, my body had reacted to Clark in a way I couldn't ignore, and it scared me. It scared me because I couldn't deny that what I'd seen had stirred something inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. That night, we had dinner together like nothing unusual had happened. I kept my cool, trying to act as normal as possible. But the tension I felt around Clark was almost unbearable. I couldn't shake the image of him in the shower, couldn't stop thinking about how he'd looked, how I'd felt in that moment. My thoughts were running wild, crossing boundaries I knew I shouldn't cross. But the more I tried to suppress them, the stronger they became. Finally, after what felt like hours of struggling with myself, I gave in. Lying there in bed, I let my mind wander. I let myself think about Clark, his body, his face, that sense of raw, youthful energy that seemed to radiate from him. I felt a rush of heat spread through me, and before I knew it, I was touching myself, trying to release the tension that had been building up all evening. I closed my eyes and let myself get lost in the fantasy, imagining what it would feel like to touch him, to run my fingers over his skin, to feel his body pressed against mine. It was wrong, I knew that, but I couldn't stop. The more I thought about him, the more intense the feeling became, until finally I felt a wave of pleasure wash over me. It was like a release, but at the same time, it only made me feel more conflicted. I must have fallen asleep right after, because the next thing I knew, I was drifting in and out of this half-conscious state. I was lying on my side, still feeling the lingering warmth of my earlier release, when suddenly I felt something. A touch, soft, gentle, around my waist. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I realized it wasn't a dream at all. Someone was there in my bed, touching me. You already know what happened that night. It's not something I'm proud of, and trust me, I've replayed it in my mind 1,000 times since. But if I'm being honest, yes, it was one of the most exhilarating, intense experiences of my life. It was like something had awakened inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. This raw, animalistic desire that I couldn't control. It was overwhelming, and in the moment, I let it consume me. The thrill of doing something forbidden, the way our bodies came together, the heat, the intensity, it was impossible to resist. Clark's hands roamed over me with an almost desperate need, and I found myself responding with just as much hunger. Every inch of his skin, every curve of his body, felt electric under my fingertips. His youth was intoxicating, the firmness of his muscles, the smoothness of his skin. It was everything I hadn't realized I'd been missing, and more. My hands explored him without hesitation, tracing the lines of his chest, his abs, the hard strength of his arms. It was like discovering something new and forbidden, and I was lost in it. I remember the way his body felt pressed against mine, the way his breath quickened as we moved together, tangled in sheets that suddenly felt too warm, too constricting. I let myself go completely, letting the moment take over, surrendering to the intensity of it all. There was no thinking, no rationalizing, just pure sensation. His touch was everywhere, and mine was on him. Both of us lost in something that shouldn't have happened, but did. When it was over, I lay there in the dark, the weight of what had just happened crashing over me like a wave. My body was still tingling, my skin still sensitive to the memory of his touch. But then the reality of the situation started to settle in, and with it, this sinking feeling of guilt. "He's your nephew," I kept repeating to myself over and over. How did we let it get this far? How had I crossed that line so easily, without even a second thought? I froze, my heart racing, as the touch became more deliberate. It was Clark. I knew it instantly. He had slipped into my bed, his arm wrapping around me from behind, his body pressing softly against mine. His breath was warm against my neck as he leaned in close and whispered into my ear, his voice low and almost hesitant. "I saw you." My entire body went cold and hot at the same time. He'd seen me peeping at him in the shower, and now he was here, right next to me, wanting me. I didn't know how to react. Every logical part of my brain was screaming at me to stop, to push him away, but my body was already responding to his touch. His hand moved gently over my hip, tracing the curve of my body, and I could feel the heat of him against my back. It was like something inside me broke free, something I couldn't control anymore. He wasn't stopping, and I wasn't pulling away. Clark lay beside me, his breathing slowing, and for a moment, I just stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything. I wasn't proud of what we'd done, but at the same time, I couldn't deny the excitement, the way it had made me feel so alive, so wanted. It had been years since anyone had touched me like that, made me feel that way. And here was this young, vibrant, incredibly attractive man. No, not just any man, my nephew. And we had just shared something that felt so intense, so powerful, it was hard to regret.